BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, a tractor protest at Parliament. It was unmissable. Let's start, though, with our topic this week, dairy farming. Today, we're looking at a disease which can decimate a dairy herd. TB. In almost 150 years of farming at Strickley near Kendal in Cumbria, the Robinson family's pedigree herd of organic dairy shorthorns has remained TB-free. Until last October, that is, when a routine TB test returned the worst possible results. Helen Millican's been hearing how 3 generations of the Robinsons, James, his son Robert and his dad Henry, have dealt with their cattle's TB diagnosis and its aftermath.
I was devastated.
It's incredibly disheartening because a lot of the cows as well were really well-bred cows, and you've lost that, and it takes a lot of years to get as good as cow like that again. So it's a lot of hard work that Dad's had to do with his breeding, and then I'm coming into it now. In total we've had, I think, 31, 32 cows that have gone.
That we've lost, yeah.
And they've all been milking cows bar 2. So about 25% of our adult herd. So it's a lot.
We are clear now.
Yeah.
So we've had the initial breakdown, which was about 12 months ago, and then every 60, 70 days, tested again in January, April, and then July. We've had reactors on all 4 of those, but they haven't been able to find any visible lesions or been able to culture anything from that either. Which means that even though we've lost 30-odd cows, they haven't been able to confirm it. They would expect it to have found some visible lesions because we've lost so many, but they haven't done. So because of that, we then have gone on to something called a non-specific reactor policy, which kind of trips off the tongue, doesn't it? None of the vets have heard of it. It's used very, very rarely. 6 months after the last short interval test, we can then test again.
And how much does that prey on your mind? They've ended up being slaughtered. You must ask yourselves, well, did they need to be?
Yeah, but we didn't have any choice in it. You can't fight it. It is what it is. Like Robert said, there was some tremendous cows that went. Some of the best cows that ever bred have ended up 1 or 2 because they're too close to calving. They get shot on farm, they get dragged up the back of a wagon. Now, that isn't how some of those cows should have left this farm at all. But that's the rules and that's what you got to do.
There's so many impacts, emotional impacts, the bureaucratic side of it, the practical side of it, the financial side of it.
We reckoned we were spending about a day a week doing TB stuff. Now, that might have been meeting with the vet, it might have been paperwork, it might have been feeding the extra animals that we had on that we couldn't sell. You think, I saw a few extra calves, I'll be able to manage a few extra calves. It's only a couple of cows in isolation, but then those few extra calves turn into 50 that aren't then little tiddlers anymore, they're then 200-300 kilo animals. One point we had, how many did we have isolated at one point? 14 or something?
Yeah.
So you're trying to isolate that many animals, keep them bedded up, keep them separate from everything else. It becomes a real daily bind.
On all the extra cake and feed, we've been organic. The rearing cake is very expensive. It all adds up financially.
Until you've had it, you don't really realise what impact it does have physically, mentally, financially. It is everything. We do feel for the neighbours as well because we feel that we've almost brought it upon them. Well, obviously, you haven't, but you do have that feeling of guilt. The neighbours have been very, very good, but I don't think we realise the complexity of it all. And you think you know about TB as a livestock farmer. Now I realise that I know nothing now, and I know a whole lot more than most. It is a very, very complex disease, complex to manage. There certainly isn't a single solution to sorting it out.
It's such an insidious disease as well. It's not like it's obvious. It catches you unaware.
Yeah, and they all look healthy. Every cow that went looked perfectly healthy. Well, and they were. Because when they slaughtered them, they haven't been able to find anything. So for all we know, this bull here that we stood in front of, he could be a reactor. Any one of those could be a reactor. Anyone on any farm could be a reactor. Just because you haven't had any TB reactors in the past doesn't mean you're not going to have one. We really, as an industry, we really must look after our own herds as best we can, and that is being really conscious about biosecurity, about buying animals in, neighbouring fences, getting people to dip their feet on and off the farm, which is something that in an area like ours that is relatively TB-free, you don't really think about. But we really absolutely should be thinking about that.
Cumbrian dairy farmer James Robinson there. The Chancellor has refused to engage over concerns about the proposed change to inheritance tax on farms. So says the President of the National Farmers Union, who was appearing before MPs just as hundreds of farmers drove their tractors into London to protest about the tax. We'll hear from that protest in a moment. First, let's hear from the House of Commons Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee, which was discussing inheritance tax as part of a wider look at the future of farming. For anyone who has somehow managed to avoid this row, in October's budget, the government said that from April 2026, inheritance tax of 20%, half the usual rate, will be imposed on farms above a threshold of £1 million. Ministers say that when other allowances are added, the majority of farms won't be affected. Farming unions disagree, arguing that the majority will be affected, and this tax spells the end of the family farm. The NFU President Tom Bradshaw told MPs he'd met with the Prime Minister, with Efra and Treasury Ministers, but not the Chancellor.
There was an offer to meet from us, and the Chancellor decided not to take that. Now, if there was going to be a big change that was going to impact our sector, maybe somebody from Treasury would have had a call or a meeting.
Tom, you were reported to have met with the Prime Minister, and it was reported that he had indicated there would be a softening in the approach. Do you have any observations about that report?
What was reported, I don't think it was that there was necessarily, but it was that he was very much listening, and it is a private meeting, and I'm not going to break the trust of that meeting. But what I would say is I felt that the Prime Minister had a far better understanding of the unintended consequences by the end of the meeting than he did at the start of the meeting. But I'm very surprised that as yet we haven't had any firm action on the back of the meeting.
Well, the NFU is calling for a pause and a consultation. Ministers have so far rejected that, saying the tax will raise much-needed cash, about £500 million a year, and will also discourage people aiming to avoid inheritance tax from buying up farmland and so driving up the price. But Dr Aaron Advani, director of the Centre for the Analysis of Taxation, CENTAX, told the committee that may not be the case.
I think the concern with the way the reform has been done is that it still leaves a 20% effective rate. It's not quite how it works, but roughly a 20% effective rate above the threshold that's been set. Now, one reason for doing that is because there are farmers who you might be concerned about who are earning, who have wealth a bit above the current tax-free threshold, who you want to give a lower rate to because of the well-documented concerns about incomes of farmers. But the downside is it still means that if you have, say, £100 million or £1 billion that you want to put into farmland, 20% rate is still much more attractive than other sorts of assets. And so what you will still have in this world is people who want to buy up agricultural land competing with genuine farmers who are trying to expand their farm, who are really actually wanting to work on the land. They're still going to have to compete with much better off people. One other just quick thing to add is that this came in a budget in which there were other reforms, removing some of the relief around pensions and also bringing former non-doms into inheritance tax. And so there are actually more people now who will be looking for ways to reduce their inheritance tax bill, which might, if anything, drive up the amount of demand for agricultural land that's still relatively tax privileged.
Dr Aaron Advani. We did ask to speak to a DEFRA minister about the inheritance tax. No one was available. In a statement, the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Steve Reed, reiterated that the government's commitment to farmers is steadfast. He went on to say that the delayed higher-tier stewardship scheme will now open in the summer, which he said is part of our £5 billion farming budget over 2 years, the largest ever directed at sustainable food production in our country's history. As we set out our plan for change, we are focused on supporting our farmers, supporting rural economic growth and boosting Britain's food security. Well, MPs can't have missed the frankly surreal sight and noise of hundreds of tractors driving past Parliament to protest against the inheritance tax. It was one of a number of protests held around the country yesterday. Organised by grassroots farming campaigns, the aim was to demonstrate the strength of feeling in farming communities. I went along and spoke to one of the organisers, Dave Catt, who farms and runs a wholesale veg business in Kent.
As an industry, we feel desperately the government have got this wrong. They haven't thought the consequences through. They're trying to target big money and people using the land as a tax loophole. But what they're actually going to do is they're going to destroy family farms who've been working for generations on the land.
Look, you are rich people who can afford to take on this because of the state of the public finances.
The land is worth a lot of money if you sell it. If you're a generational farmer, you're born on that farm, you grow up on that farm, you die on that farm. You live there for generation to generation, you earn a living. The value of it is irrelevant. I know it's worth a lot of money, but it's irrelevant to what they do. This tax will then hit people who can't afford, the farm incomes can't afford to pay that sort of tax. So therefore, they then cut the size of the farm by having to sell some farm off to pay the tax. Then it's not viable, then it's finished.
I'm just outside the gates to Downing Street, and as you look up and down Whitehall, it is covered in tractors. The organisers are expecting between 300 and 400 tractors to make it here. They're coming from all over the country for practical and logistical reasons, obviously, mainly from the southeast of England. I've spoken to a few people here, and they say they're here fundamentally because they're furious.
I think it's a fact of, I think ours is mostly inheritance tax and just what happened to the family farm. So me and my other half, so he is the 4th generation of the family farm. I'm pregnant, so I'm bringing in the 5th generation, and we want to make sure he can carry on, or he or she can carry on farming the family farm and keep it running.
The government will say, well, you've probably got a lot of time to plan for that handover. You've got a lot of time. If you've got 7 years, the farm can be gifted. There are things you can do to manage this.
There is. I think it's just a fact of when we looked at it, because we've sat down as a family obviously and had a look. It's my husband's grandfather that owns the farm. If he passes away, it's a lot more we've got to sell. So I think when we worked it out, all of our cows have got to go to be able to manage. And what's the point of being a milking dairy if you've got to get rid of most of your animals to just carry on?
Philip and Katie Cooks and Florence.
And Florence. I should add Florence is in her dad's arms. How old's Florence?
5 months.
Why are you here?
Because we strongly oppose Labour's ridiculous inheritance tax.
Why do you see it as an attack on farmers?
Well, they're just trying to grab money where they can. They probably see us as an easy target. Like a lot of people, they think farmers are worth millions. Yeah,
to be fair, lots of you are on paper worth millions.
Yeah, if we sold up and gave up farming, then yeah, we would be. But our income from it is very little. Yeah, it's worrying times.
The government will say, firstly, that it's fair. They'll also say that most people will have time to plan. They can gift the farm or make other arrangements, which means that they won't have to pay this.
Yeah, but you can gift the farm, but at 76, if my father-in-law gifts it, he's got to live another 7 years and have that hanging over his head. It's horrible. It shouldn't be like that. We shouldn't have to do it. We just shouldn't have to do it.
And the argument that we've got 10 years to pay it, yeah, that's all right, we've got 10 years to pay it, but a lot of the farms won't be making enough money to pay that extra outgoing. They'll be struggling. A lot of farms are struggling to pay the bills as it is, without this hanging around their neck as well.
Andrew Ward, I'm an arable farmer from Lincolnshire.
You organised the last protest that was held here in London.
Yeah.
Here you are at another. It's not working.
It's not working, and we always thought it would be an uphill struggle. And I think the most important thing is there's lots of these protests going on now around the country leading up to Christmas. And I think we've just got to keep plugging away and just keep nudging. All it is at the moment is nudging the government to say, hang on a minute, we're here, we're not going away.
Andrew Ward there in Whitehall. That's it from us. But if you'd like to comment on anything you've heard in today's programme, please feel very free to do so. You can email us. We're farming.today@bbc.co.uk, or you could tweet us on X, where we are at BBC Farming Today. And don't forget, Farming Today is with you weekday mornings from 5:45, but you can also set your smart speaker routine to play Radio 4 and wake up with us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Rebecca Rooney, and Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.